Welcome back to the credibleDEV YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be continuing our journey learning Bash, talking about functions in Bash. If you haven't already checked out the other videos or on our blog, we have lesson 1 and 2 both on YouTube and the blog if you want to check those out to get an introduction and to catch up with where we are now if you don't already have knowledge of how Bash scripting works. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about functions. And functions are really useful to cut down on the amount of code that you have, to make it more reusable, to make it more flexible. You can do a lot with simple functions. So we're going to break down the syntax of the functions, how you use them, some limitations of them, and some weird things with Bash functions when it comes to arguments or parameters in comparison to other programming or scripting languages. So let's jump right into the syntax of how you use a function in Bash. So I'm going to paste some code here, my code editor. And don't forget, you do need to start your Bash scripts with the shebang, or whatever you want to refer to it as, and the path to Bash, and which could be different on your system than mine. So you can use the which bash command to figure out where it is. So once you've done that, you also need to make it executable, which we talked about in the first lesson, by using the chmod plus X in your script name to make your script executable. If you don't do that, then you're not going to be able to run it. And if you don't include the location of Bash at the top of your file, you're not going to be able to run the script either. So here we have the very basic syntax for a function. So there's a few different ways to do this, and we're going to cover all of them. So the first way is with the function keyword, followed by the function name, and then you have an opening and closing parentheses. Then you have an opening bracket, and you go down into the body of the function. The body of the function would be this command here that says some command and this comment here. Anything within the body of the function is going to be executed anytime that you call the function. So you can put whatever you want inside the body of the function. You know, you can declare variables, things like that. You can call other functions. You can even call the same function within, just like you can in other languages. So the second way to declare a function is without the function keyword. So it looks exactly the same. We're just not using the function keyword. So this is the exact same one. We just took out the function keyword. That is completely valid in Bash. Another way is a single line function. A single line function would look like this, and you probably could have guessed how it looked, but one difference is the addition of the semicolon. So you need to make sure you have that semicolon, or you're going to get errors, or your script's not going to run the way that you think it was going to. So now that we've got the basic syntax out of the way, let's take a look at an example. This is a simple calculator. So some things to note, and this is one of the major differences with functions when you compare Bash to other languages, is how we deal with parameters or arguments. Typically, you would be able to add the arguments like this. So if we had a function calculator, maybe you had, integer A, integer B, something like that. That's how you would typically do it in other languages. And then you would reference the variables A and B inside the body of your function. In Bash scripting, you don't do that. So these number 1, number 2, and number 3 are referencing arguments or parameters that are passed into the calculator. So 1 is going to be the first argument in the list of arguments, 2 would be the second, and 3 would be the third. Hopefully that makes sense. You'll see what I'm talking about when we call this function with some arguments as far as how those get passed in and how the script is referencing those. This case statement is something new that we haven't talked about yet, and I'll be doing a separate video and blog post on it. So don't worry too much about that now, but essentially what's happening here is that we are matching on the third argument that is coming into this function, because we have this 3 here. So the third argument is going to be our operator, so the plus sign, minus, multiplication, division, so on. So whatever that third argument is, it's going to match one of these lines, and then it's going to do what's next to it here. So for instance, if we passed in multiplication, then it's going to set the variable result equal to the first argument times the second argument. So let's go ahead and call this function. And how you call a function in Bash is just by using its name. So in this instance, it's called calculator. Now to pass the arguments, we just type them in. So if we say 2, and our second argument is going to be the second number in our operation for this particular example, and then whatever operator we want. So we will go with multiplication. You don't have to put all of them in quotes, but with multiplication, the asterisk, you need to put it in quotes or else it won't function properly. So when we run this, what should happen is 2 times 2 will be set to the variable result. And then we can see at the end of our function, we echo what the result is. So let's go ahead and save that. And we will run our script. And we see result 4, which is exactly what we expected. One important thing to note here is that your arguments that you're passing into this function need to have spaces between them. If you omit the spaces, or if you try to put commas in there or something like that, it's not going to work the way that you expected. So let's run it again, and you can see that we're getting a syntax error. So we have to make sure that we put the spaces between. And we can do the plus sign, and like with the plus sign, we don't have to do the quotes around it. You see we get the result of 7 for 2 plus 5. But something else that you may notice here is we're setting this variable result. And in Bash, a variable that is defined or declared inside of a function is a global variable. So we can actually reference this variable outside of our function, unlike other languages. I mean, you can do that with other languages, but it's not the default. So if you truly want the variable to be local to the function, then you have to tell it to with the local keyword. You put a local in front of whatever variable name that you're defining, and then it won't be accessible outside of the function. And we'll see an example of that here in just a moment. So let me go ahead and remove this, and then I'll paste in another example. So what we're looking at here is actually 2 different things. One is the local variable, and the other thing is to talk about returning values. So in Bash, you don't really return a value or data. You can return a number, but you can't return like a string like you could in other languages, or maybe return a JSON object or something like that. You're not going to be able to do that in Bash. So you would set a variable instead, and then access that variable outside of the function. And I'll show you in just a moment how we can use that return keyword, just as an example. But first, we're going to look at the local variable versus a global variable. So here we're setting name equal to the CD, and that is a global variable, which means I should be able to access it outside of the function. And then we're also setting another variable called age and setting that equal to 100, and we have local in front of it, which means that we should not be able to access this variable outside of the function. And then we're calling the function here before we try to access these variables. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier was you have to set up and declare your function before you can call it. A lot of programming languages allow you to, reference a function before you've actually defined it. Maybe it's defined further down in the code, and that works with a lot of languages, but that's not going to work with Bash. So make sure you've defined your function first before you reference it or any of the variables that are used within it. So let's go ahead and save this, and then we'll run it. Clear out our terminal. So what we notice here is that the CD, which was the global variable, is printed out, and we don't see age. Even though we attempted to echo it, we just see blank space here. And that's because it's a local variable. It's only accessible within the return test function. So now let's go ahead and take a look at another example. So I'm going to add in return 100. And this is going to return the value 100. Then we're going to talk about how this works and how it may not work how you expect. So first, to echo out or to access that return code from this, the way that you do that is with the $sign and a question mark. And what this is actually doing is it's accessing basically the success code or the error code of the last operation that the bash script did. So when we access it here, we should get 100. Now, if we do this same thing again, we echo the $sign and the question mark again down here, we'll get something different. And the reason for that is when we called it up here, the last thing we did was calling this function, which returned 100. But when we call it down here, the last thing that happened was we were echoing the age. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we'll run it and see what happens. So as you can see, the first time we get the 100 that we expected, but down here we get 0. And we get 0 because this command, even though age didn't have a value on it, it was successful. So the return code was 0. So that's one important thing to keep in mind when you think that you're returning something. You really need to consider when you're trying to access that return value, or you may not get what you expect. So another thing that you can do is set the return value, or set the output, not the return value, to a variable. And you do this in a lot of other languages too, where you'll define some variable and you'll set it equals to, and then you call the function. And that way, whatever comes back from the function gets fed into that variable. You can do the same thing in bash. So let's take a look at an example of that. So here we have a function that simply echoes credibleDEV. And then after that, we set the result to the function. And this is how you would do that with the $sign. Then you need to put your function inside of parentheses. And then we'll echo out the value that is held within result, which should be credibleDEV. Clear the terminal. Run it again. And we can see that that's exactly what happens. So that's it for functions. Like I said, if you haven't checked out the other videos or the blog posts, make sure you do. And also give me a follow on Twitter, because whenever I post the new blog posts, which typically those come up before the videos, that's where I post those updates too. So be sure to give a follow there. Give a like on this video if it helped you out, or the series has helped you out in learning something new. I really hope it has. If you have any questions, you want to know how to do something in bash, let me know down in the comments and I'll try to help you out the best I can. That's it for this video. Everybody have a great day. Thanks.